Thank you. All right. So I hope that you'll understand why we're doing speaking with this chapter. Right? Does that make sense to you? Yeah. Okay, good. Excellent. All right. So a lot of the information in this chapter, some of the more detailed stuff we'll do in 658 in terms of, and you've also done actually, those of you that have done 555 in terms of what the phonetic system is and so on. Although we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about suprasegmentals as opposed to segmentals. But one of the interesting parts of this chapter was this idea, quote, in the mid to late 1970s, egged on by a somewhat short-lived anti-grammar approach, some teachers turned away from accuracy issues in favor of natural language activity. So that's what I meant when I said to Sandy, this isn't really, the direct approach doesn't really address accuracy in pronunciation, okay? It is very much based on this idea of natural language activity. So you didn't pinpoint and focus on a particular sound or issue and sort of work that to the bone. You know, that's really audiolingualism, which is what we'll do next week. But in addition to the sort of anti-grammar, that also means anti-working on pronunciation, right? Anti-really focusing directly on pronunciation structure. So, you know, it became a question in the 80s and the 90s. Should we be doing explicit instruction of pronunciation? Is this something that was worth doing? Is this something that would actually stymie students' ability to really work through natural language, or should we focus on pronunciation? Well, again, I have a pretty strong view based on the research that says that, yes, we should for adult learners. There is a not inconsiderable amount of research that suggests that it is helpful to focus on pronunciation, and no research that I know of that suggests that it is harmful. All right. So again, as I throw these empirical things out here, should you be able to find something in the literature, consider yourself to be extra credited. But over time, from when we're talking about the direct approach and audiolingualism that we'll talk about next week, we've moved from a focus on segmentals only to a focus on segmentals and suprasegmentals. So what do I mean by segmentals and suprasegmentals? Okay, which one? Okay, so let's start with segmentals. What are segmentals?
Different syllables and phonemes.
Syllables?
Segmentals are phonemes.
Yes, the things phony, the things that make up syllables, right? Consonants and vowels. Segmentals means any consonant, sorry, I was doing it sort of, any consonants, any vowels, okay? So segmentals means all of those. So it also includes, obviously, the arrangement in which consonants and vowels go. Suprasegmentals, Savannah's already mentioned stress. What else? Intonation, which includes pitch, syllable stress, intonation structure, rhythm, okay? All these things form part of suprasegmentals. Now, typically, these were not addressed at all, okay? In textbooks that people used up through the 80s, these were not addressed. So there was some argument that you couldn't address it effectively, so it wasn't addressed. However, in terms of empirical evidence, because no one really addressed it, there was no empirical evidence to say whether it was or wasn't effective because it hadn't been done. So that research is still underway. But I want to do a couple of examples of what might be a super segmental exercise with you guys from my book that's coming out in Michigan next year. So I'm going to ask Shihun to hand these out. And when you get it, it's 2 pages. Please don't look more than the top page, okay? Because all the answers are on. So if you start looking at it, you'll see all the answers and it's a complete waste of time, okay? So just look at the top page. Do not turn the pages. Okay, so this is something I did at a conference last year, but it's also something that's going to come out in my textbook next year. It says don't cite or reproduce. You can absolutely use these exercises in the classrooms with your student, but don't reproduce them anywhere else because they're now copyrighted by Michigan Press. For those of you at home, this is called teaching tip materials in your doc share. All right, so what I wanted to do was show that you could teach information about intonation and that it was a valuable thing to do. So one of the reasons that intonation, and you may remember this from your own learning, is often discussed as not being teachable is because it changes too much, right? And it depends on attitude and it depends on all these kind of things, which is actually not true. Okay, it's probabilistic, not deterministic, which means we can predict what is likely, but even more importantly, what is not likely to happen. But we can't predict it in absolute terms, okay? Ultimately, individual speakers will decide what they want to say. And that it's tricky to present the system if you just use individual sentences, like the things that we saw in Betty Azar, for example, because intonation works in discourse. It's pragmatic, right? It's like that thing we did with articles, and the, okay? The choice of intonation that you use depends on the context that you're in, okay? So we're going to look at a couple of things. The first one we're going to look at, exercise 1, division of speech into tone units. Has anyone done this before? You have. Okay, okay. So if you've done it before, don't cheat and tell the people that haven't done it before. I'm obviously going to have to find a second set of exercises. I was looking and I was thinking, wait, I think a couple of people have done this before. Okay, so with the person next to you, read the text and predict where you think the unit boundaries might appear in that little boxed thing right there. Last time I was in an airport, I was between planes and I had to make a point. So just decide where you think the pauses would appear and just put a double slash in those places, okay? Okay. Carmen, just think of it as a pause. Anywhere you think, as you say it, anywhere you think you would pause, just put a slash. Yeah. Don't think about it too much, but you do need a pen. Yeah. Yeah, this is, you imagine somebody speaking this. Where would they pause as they were speaking? Okay. Just why it doesn't happen. Yes, exactly. Just where would they pause if they were saying this out loud? Yep. This is a spoken text. Yep. Okay, it doesn't matter if you haven't quite finished. Tell me where, let's start with you guys. Wampa and Nana, where did you put your first pause?
After time, last time.
So last time.
I was at an airport, pause.
Mm-hmm.
I was between planes and I had to make an important phone call, pause.
Mm-hmm.
I looked around, pause. And all the planes were busy, pause. So, pause. I waited in line.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Jade and Carmen, do you agree with that?
We had the pause after the last time, but not after. I look around and all the phones were busy.
So you just had, I looked around and all the phones were busy. Pause.
Yeah.
Okay.
And no, not after so. So I waited in line and waited and waited.
Okay, good. Sandy, did you have similar ones?
I didn't have as many. Same thing, not a pause after so, but I did put a pause after I waited in line.
Okay.
And waited and waited.
Okay, good. So this has worked exactly as I hoped, which is that there are different ways in which speakers can break up units in speech, okay? There's not one single right way or that everybody has to do. So if you do me a favor and turn over one page, but try not to look at the other one. So you're just looking at the back of your first page. This is one possible division. Last time I was at an airport, I was between planes and I had to make an important phone call. I looked around and all the phones were busy. So I waited in line and waited and waited. Finally, I began to listen, etc. Okay. But underneath is another one, what I call teenage speak. Last time I was in an airport, I was between planes and had to make an important phone call. I looked around, all the phones were busy, so I waited in line and waited and waited. So much longer units. And we could totally have one in which we did what Wampa and Nana had, which was to take off the adverbial unit. So last time, and then so, and also just as we did with finally, right? Because they're adverbial units. So if you have a look at the explanation, in the first version, complex clauses are divided into separate units. So last time I was at the airport, I was between planes, which is what Wampa and Nana were really doing, and individual clauses and repeated items. And in the second version, there are far fewer unit boundaries, and syntactic units are much larger. However, they continue to make semantic sense. I noticed that none of you said, last time I, pause, was at an, pause, airport I was, pause, right? So this is what we mean by probabilistic, okay? We can't guarantee that you're going to split the adverbial phrases from the individual clauses. We can't guarantee that you're going to split up the complex clauses or keep them together. But we can guarantee there's a whole load of things you're not going to do, because the information structure would not be appropriately communicated. And we can look at some of how this is done in the summary. One piece of information, a question, one clause, division of concept clauses, adjuncts such as however, finally, and so on. Okay, so that's what we mean by probabilistic. And so the students that you have there's more than one way to do this. Okay, they just have to know what the guidelines are for pieces of information. Let's have a look at a second intonational thing. Go back to your first page. This time we're going to look at highlighting information. So by highlighting information using prominence, prominence is the word for sentence stress. Okay, so it's not word stress, it's sentence stress. So this has already been divided for you into tone units. This is a lecture that was given by a lecturer that appears in the Michigan Corpus of Academic Spoken English. So you can actually listen to this lecture and see it online. And this is the first 5 units of that lecture. So what I want you to do is put an underline or a dot or whatever under any syllables in each unit. There could be more than one per unit that you think that he made prominent, that he stressed as opposed to unstressed. Okay, so you're not looking at word stress, you're looking at sentence stress. Okay, give it a go.
Can there be more than one?
Yes. Yes. Typically in English, there's 1 to 3 per unit. It's interesting, Naomi, listening to him. All right. It doesn't matter if you haven't finished. Let's see where you are. Let's start this time with Carmen and Jade. What prominence did you have in Unit 1?
Wanna and today.
Wanna and today.
Yes.
So what I want to do today,
Yes.
okay? Who else had that or something different? Wampa?
What and do.
What and do. What I want to do today, okay, good.
I only did today.
You only had what I want to do today. So, yeah, you're very much the fast talker, Sandy. Yeah, what I want to do today, okay. What about the second one, Sandy?
Overview.
Is give you an overview of women and work. Okay, what else did we get? Savanad?
Overview and women.
Okay, overview of women and work. Okay. Did anyone get anything else?
Women
And work.
And overview.
Overview of women and work, right? 3 important pieces of information, right? Okay, let us take a look at the second page. This is what the guy did. Okay, I transcribed this from my case. This is what the native speaker did when he was doing this. What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. What I will be emphasizing is how cultural notions of womanhood determine women's work experience, okay? That's what he did. Okay. Now, what different things that you had wanna, right?
We had
No.
what and do it.
What and do. What I want to do today, which is perfectly reasonable, right? It's another way of doing it. Okay. Did anyone put I? No. Why not? Because again, it's probabilistic. If he said, what I want to do today, how does that sound?
Egocentric.
It does. It sounds very egocentric. And teachers, generally speaking, try not to be egocentric. They try to get everybody involved rather than just. So the likelihood of him saying, what I want to do today is not high. And you all recognize that. None of you chose that. Okay. Now, the fact that you chose what, wanna, do, or today is all good. Okay. It turns out he's a speed reader, like a speed speaker, like Sandy, and he just blew through everything until today. Okay. But then you did recognize that he probably wanted to focus overview women and work, right? These are the new pieces of information that he's trying to communicate to the students, right? This is what we're going to do today. So you should be listening for overview of women and work. Again, he doesn't use I will. He could have said what I will be emphasizing, right? But if, no, you don't like that. Okay. Did you guys have just emphasizing?
I would choose emphasize.
You just had emphasizing. Good. So again, probabilistically, he chose, and he did, in fact, do that. And then what did you get for 4? Did anyone have the same thing for 4? Cultural and womanhood?
The new information.
Yeah.
I had how.
How? Is how cultural notions, you could certainly do that. Yeah, you could certainly do that. What you wouldn't do is say, is how cultural, right? Right? Unless there was a performance problem. He might be slowing down and sort of saying, is, right? But he wouldn't deliberately do it for informational purposes, right? And then, did anybody highlight women's in the 5th unit? Oh, you did? Okay. Did anybody else? No. So chances are we probably wouldn't. Why wouldn't we? chances are we probably wouldn't re-highlight women because
It's like old information.
old information, right? We already know it's women. He said women. He's said women a couple of times. Women, womanhood.
Yeah.
So he doesn't feel the need to say women, emphasize women again, right? So again, I've given you an explanation. A speaker's choice of prominence derives from information structure. The more information a unit contains, the more prominences are likely to be present. In contrast, many function words, such as gonna and so on, or repeated words such as women, are less likely to be emphasized. A useful starting place is to think of the typical structure of a tone unit of English. So a tone unit is between the two slashes, as comprising approximately 3 to 7 words and containing 1 or 2 prominences. And that obviously completely depends. That's for spontaneous or semi-spontaneous speech, but for different kinds of speech, it will be different. One of the examples I use in my book is Lady Diana. You all remember Lady Diana, or tragic Lady Diana, who really struggled to speak in public. So she got a speech coach. And one thing the speech coach did was slow her down and make her do extra prominences. So one of the examples I have in my book is her, and she literally does like 3 or 4 word units with 2 prominences in them, and then has a long pause, a long what we call rhetorical or dramatic pause between them. And this was to help her to not rush through and be ineffective in her public speaking. So the notion of important information depends, but in general it means information considered important from the perspective of the speaker. So something that the speaker wants you to hear. So again, we see that the bottom line with suprasegmental structure in this way is pragmatic, not syntactic. Okay, the speaker chooses based on what he or she believes the hearer needs to hear. Okay, and in English uses that stress to do it. In different languages we use different ways, right? In Chinese things are moved around. Some things are fronted, some things are put behind. In English we tend to do it using this sentence stress prominent structure. Any questions about that? Many of the teachers I've presented this to, and I say to them, I think they think it's not ideal in the sense that there's no absolute right or wrong answer. But the truth is there isn't an absolute right or wrong answer when it comes to speaking English at this level. In this case, it would be for academic purposes, right? Because it is about context. It's about pragmatics. So what you want to do is keep presenting this stuff and have the students work through it the way we just work through it, rather than just provide them with a system of rules and individual sentences that then when they get into the real world don't work. So that's one thing on teaching that's changed between the time sort of I started in the 80s and now, is that we will say intelligibility and effectiveness in speech comes not just with learning how to pronounce the and, you know, per and burr, but also with being able to effectively use suprasegmental structure of English. But now, you know, I compared you to a native speaker there, right? That was a native speaker, and that's fine for exercise purposes, especially for suprasegmentals. But the truth is, over 99% of adult learners will fail to sound like a native speaker of a so-called prestigious variety of English. What do I mean by that when I say they will fail to sound like a native speaker of a so-called prestigious variety?
I have an accent?
Yeah, so you won't sound like Shelby, okay? And you won't sound, although I should have to say mine is not a prestigious variety, I don't know if Shelby's is, you won't sound like me either. But generally speaking, you don't sound native if you're, so you'll have some non-native features that are, and why is that? Brown talks about that. One of the issues is age, but not for the way you might think. There's a lot of research on this, and if it's an issue you're interested in, you can look at it. But there used to be this idea that the critical period said that if you got to about maybe 13 or 14, to puberty, and you hadn't learned it, you sort of go off a precipice, right? And you're never going to sound like a native speaker. What Jim Flegge, who I work with in Alabama, and the speech learning model and other people have shown is that that's not exactly true. You don't, if you start looking at learners, they don't, and look at their native-like pronunciation. If that were true, if there was a critical period where it turned off, you would have these learners that you tested up until 14, 15, and then it would go and it would sink like a stone, right? Which is not what happens. What actually happens is it goes up and then it starts getting sort of more level, but it doesn't, there's clearly, he would argue, and I'm sold, that there's no neurological biomechanism that suddenly turns off and you are no longer, you know, processing this in the same way. There's not good evidence for that. However, it's clear that if you're past puberty, you don't do so well. So what we want to do is not necessarily say, well, that's because there's some neurobiomechanism that turns your brain off, but it may be a lot of other factors, which is a lot more likely. So one might be native language. So if you think of your phonological system and your articulators, you know, if it's if you're talking about a language in which the muscle memory is completely different from the language that you're learning, you have a lot more to learn, right? If you're really having to do a lot of different things with your articulators and so on. Another one is exposure. There's no way adults get the same kind of exposure to spoken language that children get, particularly adults in an EFL environment, but also many adults in an ESL environment. We also know that there's something called phonetic coding ability, and this is what the Army tests for by using various tone tests where essentially some of us are better at hearing differences between pitches and difference between categorizations of sounds than others of us, okay? So one of the tests that the Army does right at the beginning with its recruits is to see if you're good at that or not so good at that. Because if you're good at that, they might track you into a language program and chances are you'll do better than somebody who isn't good at that. And that's what's called phonetic coding. And we don't know a lot about it, but it does look like with many other, as with many other things, some of us are better. Some of our systems are better at hearing and perceiving different categories than others of us are. Identity and agency, we've talked about before. Many adult learners don't want to pretend to be an American. They'd rather sound like a Spanish person speaking English or a French person speaking English because they are a Spanish person speaking English, or a French, but you know, they're quite happy to be that person. They don't particularly want to be anybody else. And agency, of course, in that sense as well. And concern for pronunciation is very similar. This idea of some learners are just not interested in working on that. They're not motivated to work on that aspect of their language learning. And it could be for identity reasons, it could be for a whole host of reasons. But if you add up all those other factors, you can see why you can't just say there's a lot of support for a neurobiological kind of click that goes off. There really isn't. Well, so what there is an argument on both sides. And if anybody's interested, if you go to my website, which you can get to through the Applied Linguistics Lab, I actually did an article for a second language acquisition textbook for Routledge where I discussed both sides of this argument. So arguments that there is some kind of neurobiological trigger and that there is no evidence for that. So if you're interested in that, please go ahead and take a look. But anyway, the point is, you're probably not going to sound like a native speaker. So we're thinking about this issue of intelligibility and what intelligibility is. Jihen's going to take this around for you. A friend of mine who's a wonderful phonologist, Dr. Richard Caldwell, wrote an article about this, which is in your doc share. It's called Lord Rant, A Personal Journey Through Accent and Intelligibility. He was trying to work out, basically the argument now is that intelligibility should not be judged only by native speakers of English, because a lot of people are no longer native speakers of English. And why is it that native English speakers have been given the sort of privilege of judging all the rest of us? Okay, so he invented what he called Lord Rant, a grumpy old man in his early 70s who believes the English language is his stately home, a building of unique architecture with pictures of presiding deities such as Shakespeare, Dickens, Queen Elizabeth II. He believes that the fabric of English is unchanging, but that nevertheless requires policing and maintenance so it can be handed down pure and intact. Because he is the native speaker, he is the authoritative source of information on the rules of English. He and people like him are the owners of English. And he wrote this from that perspective to try and understand how these sort of very strange judgments and prejudices against different dialects and accents have come about. So we're not going to discuss it here, but you can go home and read it. It's fun. He talks about L1 regional accents, parents and teachers who say, oh, honey, you have to talk properly, otherwise you're not going to get a job. He also talks about anti-Americanism, which I'm sure is now on the rise with with our beloved leader. So, so what, if you're interested, he talks about it from a British perspective, but if you're interested in looking at it from an American perspective, the book to buy, and it's a fantastic book, is Rosina Lippi-Green's English with an Accent, Language, Ideology and Discrimination in the United States. It's just a fantastic summary of all that, basically. The prejudice against accents, where they come from, why it's ridiculous, you know, what it does to people, and so on. So I would strongly recommend that if you're interested. You can get it pretty cheap. I think there's a second edition, but the first edition is perfectly fine. You can get it really cheap now. So instead now we have these new priorities, right? So let's think about some of these questions. What's a correct accent? Anyone?
Would it be like your accent, your British accent?
Carmen? Well, do you think it is?
I would just think that because you sound more fancy.
No, and you know what's hilarious about that is that my accent in English is working class. So in England, when I go home, I am not fancy at all. In fact, I am the opposite of fancy. Yep. So I find that kind of, that's one of the things that's so bizarre about the idea of accent and credibility. Good point.
I would say there is no correct accent because we have the same debate
Right.
for Spanish. Right?
Spanish.
Like my accent is considered the correct one, and that's not true. Okay, I have 21 countries.
Right. So Naomi is saying, for those of you out there, that it's the same issue with Spanish, and I agree. And because Naomi is from Spain, Peninsular Spanish. That's considered to be the gold standard, right? In the same way that British English is often considered to be the gold standard of English. But Naomi says that's not true. And why do you say that's not true?
That's not true, because every country has an academic level, right? They teach the Spanish in school, so there is like inside of every country they have like the standard, right? And then they have another dialect and everything. But they country develop their own Spanish, so we have a lot of words. I don't use that word, but they are perfectly correct. Yeah.
Right. So that's sort of where we are now, right? In 2017, there isn't a correct accent. Okay.
It's context-based.
Precisely.
Context that
Yeah.
Each context, if you are in the United States, you'd better speak like American with their accent, because the purpose of speaking is communicating.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the better you can convey your message, communicate your message. That's the factor that defines what the correct accent is.
Which would be nice if that were true, but it isn't, right? Because Carmen already said, my accent is much better than hers, and she's an American. So she's quite happy for me to communicate with her in British English in America. In fact, this has been the history of my successful teaching. The fact that I walk in a door and everyone goes, oh my God, she's like British. She must be like so smart. And I'm like, oh. And then in addition, they give me higher evaluations, which I discovered when I went and started teaching online. So now I do podcasts online so they can hear me still. Only to undergraduates, everybody. Graduate students, I credit you with much more intellectual ability. Yeah.
I believe like about that new priorities, it's just the correct answer actually accent could be the one that is more comprehensible. Like it doesn't block communication.
Right,
Like,
right.
You pronounce some words if a
Yeah.
native speaker can understand.
So I took Savanaz's answer very literally, but that's what she was basically saying, that the issue becomes the second one, which is intelligibility versus accentedness, which seems like it should be a fairly straightforward thing, right? On the basis that we can test when we do research on intelligibility and accentedness, we know they're separate measures, right? They measure out separately. People will judge accentedness as high and still judge intelligibility as high in some instances. So we know that they're judging them on separate, and vice versa. They will judge accentedness as a measure as lower, but comprehensibility as more difficult. Okay, so there's not a parallel correlation between judgments of accentedness and intelligibility. So that's okay, but the problem becomes intelligible to whom and for whom. And what's the issues there, do you think?
Communication is between like non-native natives when they try to speak English.
Don't move me down that one yet. Let's stay there. Let's stay on the second one. Let's stay with native speakers for a sec. What's the problem there with native speakers?
Native speakers have different accents as well.
Could be.
Even
Yeah.
between among native speakers. For example, I think of my father's example of traveling to Madrid for the first time. He couldn't understand a word of what they were saying. So and it would happen the same thing, where Americans can or cannot understand a very deep countryside British accent or Australian or whatever. So
This is all true, of
Any
course.
region?
If we're talking extremes of accents, this is all true. But let's stay with the idea of generally intelligible and generally not accented at the extreme. What still becomes the problem? Talked about this a little bit before in one of our
because in it says the native speaker tend to have lower degree of tolerance to understand the
what's it called? WTC.
willingness.
Good. 4 or 5 classes. It's worth it. It's worth sitting in on my classes. It's worth sitting in on my classes 4 or 5 times because then you just get it, right? So yes. So generally speaking, unfortunately, what tends to happen is the native speakers have a lower willingness to communicate and require non-native speakers to be better than they require other native speakers to be, right? Because they carry the linguistic power in the interaction in America, okay? So we talked about this a little bit with Indian speakers. The Indian English speakers who've been speaking Indian English since they were like, you know, grasshoppers, come over and they start speaking Indian English and Americans say, WTF, and the Indian speakers are like, what? It's English, it's just Indian English. And the Americans are like, not my problem, dude, totally your problem. You need to learn how to speak English properly, right? So what happens, unfortunately, is intelligibility gets mixed up with attitude and aspects of linguistics that have nothing to do with actual intelligibility, right? They have to do with attitude, identity, with power, and educational power, and all these other things that we see going on. So although intelligibility is the new priority, as it should be, right? We're not going to try and make everyone start trying to speak like me or like Shelby. In and of itself, it doesn't solve all the problems, right? Because intelligibility is not a gold scientific standard like the physics rule of, you know, gravity, right? So we've still got work to do on that. And the last new priority is where Jade was going. So tell us, Jade, what you were about to say.
Actually, you talked about the inner and outer circles and like how non-native speakers are like, you know, communicating with each other more and more. And so the Englishes that they use is somehow unique.
Yeah.
And the way they communicate with each other, so they're like comprehensible to each other to some extent.
Yeah, good. So the other priority is this idea of ELF, English as a lingua franca. It became clear 15 or so years ago from the research that came out that there are millions more people interacting as non-native speakers of English with other non-native speakers of English than there are native speakers talking to native speakers, okay? Millions. So in other words, so again, this goes back to this Lord Rant thing where he believes that he is the owner of English, right, down here. And everything tells us that this is, you know, in all essential ways of communication, no longer the truth. So what we've started to do is look at English as a lingua franca as its own thing, okay, as opposed to judging everything from a native speaker standard. And what we find is that English as a lingua franca, or ELF, interaction has certain characteristics and issues that don't hold true for native speaker interaction. Now that's something that we'll actually talk about a lot in when you do 658 with me. There's a chapter in my book on that we've discussed, so I'm not going to really get into it now, but just so you know, that's another one of the new priorities. So if it turns out that you're teaching a English for Business course to a bunch of people from, you know, China, who are going back to deal with a bunch of people from Japan and Thailand, you're not necessarily going to have the same priorities as someone who's teaching a bunch of people who want to stay in America, right? That's really what that's. So it opens up the idea of speaking skills and what we should focus on depending upon context. Any questions about that? Jade?
Question. You talked about the power, about the, so you can see actually it's still like, the powers are still so crystal clear because all these countries, they chose English as a medium of communication than other languages, they're like a bunch of other languages.
Right.
So why English? So they kind of like exert power this way. Like,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it all comes from a really bad place, right? Because there was a lot of English in the, I mean, it basically, you get a choice of the colonial languages, right? So you get English, Dutch, Spanish, or French. And, Spanish is doing great in certain parts of the world. It's become the lingua franca. But across the world in general, we were the meanest, the horriblest, and went to the most places and were horrible to the most amount of people. And now you get English. Obviously, that's an oversimplification. But yeah, the truth is languages have always had or not had power. And in our sort of, as we move into the 21st century, we're still working with stuff that happened in the 20th and the 19th century. Now, there's more than 1 billion Chinese, right? So who knows, in the 22nd, a lot of these sci-fi movies and books and stuff are now saying that we're all going to speak some version of Chinese by the end of this century. So who knows if the power is going to shift. Yeah, but absolutely, English is a powerful lingua franca, the most powerful lingua franca in the world at the moment. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, the reason is not only power, because American values had the attraction to become international values. Values like democracy. Everybody is inclined to accept these values. Therefore, that's not only power.
Well, so that's what we would call soft power, right? So there's a whole lot of like hard power, which is sort of economics, right? Who's got the biggest army and the biggest navy and the most money in the economy. But then there's all kinds of aspects of what we would call soft power, cultural, I mean, America's soft power has inundated the whole world through Hollywood, right? And as you say, through media and espousing these kinds of values. So it's still sort of power, but it's a different kind of power. Yeah, I mean, I don't see very many movies, from some of the countries that you guys come from, right? So, but you're all inundated in your own countries with American movies, I assume. Yeah, right. Any other? Okay. All right, so to go briefly back to the book, just to make sure that you guys have focused on what was in the book, he gave you some macro and macro skills of speaking, 350 to 352. I don't particularly want to go through these. You can read, but let me know if you've got any questions. Anybody had any questions? In other words, you've got to think of everything from accuracy at a micro level to fluency at a macro level, and he takes you through all those things. He also takes you through this idea of transactional versus interactional speaking. Can someone, describe that difference to me?
Wasn't it about like if you have a planned conversation, like you go to the store, you know what you're gonna say to get your that interaction? But then interaction would be like spontaneous conversation.
So that sounds a little more like schema, which is like when you go to a store, you know what should happen to you. You know that the person's going to say, cash or credit or, you know, whatever. So that's really what we would call schema, although it is a transactional event. But that's not what transactional really means.
You do not care about your the person you are talking about. Transaction.
It's a communication that involves the exchange of information.
Yes, that's really, so you might not care and you might be in a store, but the definition that we're looking for is that it's a transactional speech is that involves communicating of information of one kind or another, right? So that the message that you have to communicate, the informational message, is the important issue, right? What about interactional?
That's just one thing, like social management.
Good. Yeah, so that's chit chat. That's also something we might call phatic communication, right? So communication that has more of a social purpose, interacting with somebody, chit chatting, gossip, complaining, right, absolutely. So when we think about the important thing about that from the perspective of your students is that they can be very good at interactional communication and really bad or not as good as at transactional information, yet the high stakes situations, the one that they're likely to be judged on, are usually those transactional situations, not the interactional situations. Shall we?
Is it accurate to say that direct method really is just focusing on transactions?
Absolutely. Interactional. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess when I think of, but when I think of interactional, I think of more like the social dial, it's more for like, because they focus on like full sentence formation.
Yeah, well, that's to teach the grammar.
Gotcha.
That's to teach the grammar. But the direct method is not really interested in, if we're talking like heavy duty transactional, the kind of transactional I'm talking about, it absolutely would cover the kind of thing that Diego was talking about, where, you know, cash or credit, or because that's a, basic level functional English that it would cover.
From the direct method, do students get baptized by fire later and realizing you don't have to respond in full sentences in like real social interaction in terms of?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You'd have to find someone that learned it. Yeah, I did. But I mean, as an adult, I think you could make that shift, right? But it would definitely, direct method would definitely have a transactional component in the sense that it would cover basic functional things like, do you want a glass of water? No, I don't want a glass of water. In the same way that it would cover, how are you? I'm fine, right? But if we think of transactional at a much higher level, at an advanced level, you're talking about transactional things that, just think about something like academic purposes. Transactional would include office hours with your professor, right? And being able to negotiate the transactional and interactional potential parts of that, right? It would include writing a email to your, well, we're talking about speaking, so never mind.
Job interviews.
Job interviews, it would include. One that I've got here for you.
Phone calls?
Phone calls. Here you are making a phone call to your school to say that your kid is, you know, going to the dentist or is sick, you know, and you can't make yourself understood on the phone. So the example I've given you here is from a book called Speaking Effectively, which is designed to help adult learners who are up to their eyes in academic English in an environment where they have to speak English. And this one is very specifically about how you interpret a diagram. So let's say that you have to give a presentation. On the second page, they give you a typical diagram of an eyeball. So let's say you have to give a presentation in biology as a grad student or an international undergrad student. How do you do that? That's a high stakes situation. That's what you're going to be judged on, right? That's what your grade in the class is going to rely on, whether you can give a good presentation or not give a good presentation, right? So this text is specifically designed for those people. What it does, well, how does it help? What you tell me what it does. As you look through it, why would this be helpful for?
Kind of guides you through with an outline of step by step what you should present.
Good. It guides you through an outline of
Content.
right, of step by step what your audience is expecting you to present, right? If you have to give this diagram. What else does it give you? The actual language, right? The actual language that you need to use to do that. For example,
I am going to describe.
Yes.
As you can see.
I am going to describe, as you can see, now that you have an orientation, you know, it gives you all this transactional kind of language for this particular high stakes situation that the students can practice. And then on the second page, example 2 is a process, right? A description of a process. So you can see this is a typical textbook that you would use for an academic spoken English, developing academic spoken English, right? And then at the back, your assignments are, you know, it gives you some first of all, it scaffolds you by, I haven't included this, but it scaffolds you by giving you some sample diagrams that they can work from. And then it says, now you select a diagram and you work from it. So if you were in a speaking class for English for academic purposes, this would be something that you would want to do, right? Because you would want your students to be successful at outlining that. That's just one purpose. Right? There are lots of other purposes that you can deal with. Think, for example, of courses for English for tour guides, right? Where they have very specific kinds of phrases and transactional things that they teach them so that they will be successful. But there's all kinds of things. There's courses in English for nurses, right? What kinds of language do you need for nursing and so on? Okay, so one of the things is this issue that we often judge people, or we judge our learners on their ability to chit-chat. That's often what we're asking them to do in class, either to chit-chat or to answer questions, do direct, what we call, what do we call it? Initiation, response, feedback, IRF exchanges, where I ask for something, initiation, you give me a response, I say, yay, happy you, and then we all say, yay, they're great, right? But then when we move on to the real business that you have to produce of transactional information, there your learners can really struggle. So we want to make sure that we keep those things that obviously you want to give them some practice in interactional, you want them to make friends, but you also don't want to assume that just because they can chit-chat away, they can deal with the other issues that they've got to deal with, because usually that's not true. Then any questions about that previous bit? No? Okay, so we've just got a couple more important things I want to go through. Yeah. One is error treatment. There's a diagram. It's like super complicated. It's in your book on page 383. feel free to muse upon that diagram. I mean, the idea is to give you some idea of the process of error treatment. And, you know, often we do error treatment on the fly in classrooms. So it's to sort of give you an idea of how you might think that through. But two really important things are mistake versus error and local versus global. So a mistake is something that a native speaker might make. So for example, I'm always saying cursory, which is wrong, right? It's cursory, right? So I don't know how many of the rest of my native speaker colleagues make. What do you say?
I say pedestal instead of pedestal.
Oh, pedestal, right. I always say cursory, and sounds like it's cursory.
He's the one who corrects me too.
Yeah, well, next time correct him, because he says productors instead of producers. But he knows that's wrong, okay? And obviously I know cursory is, you know, like it's a mistake. It's not a systematic error in my, you know, I know it's cursory. No, we don't say cursory. Okay, so maybe that example's not working really well, but yeah, when I write it, I write cursory, and I know what it is. So it's not like there's a problem in my system. And what you don't want to do is start correcting your learners on every single word they get wrong, every single pronunciation they get wrong, unless it's clear it's an error and not a mistake. Okay, and an error would mean they've got a systematic problem. In their current interlanguage system, they've got an error. Okay, something is wrong. All right.
So then would you say that Dr. Ricardo's
Oh, he knows it's
an error?
No, his was a mistake because he said it.
He's aware of it.
Actually, this slide, part of this slide is from last year, and I did that because he made me cross, because he said, you say cursory. And so the first mistake I heard him make, I just stuck it in there. And it was productors. But, you know, every so often he makes mistakes here and there, but native speakers do too, right? So, yeah, do you? No.
This is a mistake.
Yeah, he knows it's producers. Yeah, sorry. You know, no, I don't have a systematic error up there. They're both mistakes. Yeah. Sorry. Well, let's think of an error let's think of your learners. Who has a learner that they might be, or you yourself, that might have a systematic error? Something's wrong with your grammar system somewhere.
I don't know. I have a question about it. Like, I have that mistake. Like, I don't know. I know it.
Right.
But I repeat it a lot. Like,
yeah.
She and he most of the time. When
right.
And it's like really, it happens a lot.
That's a mistake.
Is it like a fossilized?
Yeah, it could be a fossilized mistake, but it's a mistake because you know that I'm a she and he's a he, right? You know that that's how it works in English. So now it might be a mistake an error is when something is wrong with your system, like you're using the wrong verb tense, or every time you try and use a verb tense, you're getting it wrong, okay? Or you're systematically pronouncing something incorrectly and you don't realize you're pronouncing it incorrectly.
Then we might not be able to tell you that we have an error, because then by the
time
it's an error, it becomes
right. So that's what your job is as a teacher, to work out from your students what's an error and what's a mistake, right? So, and you do that obviously by listening to your students. That's one of the reasons they're supposed to speak 70% of the time and you're only supposed to speak 30% of the time, so you can hear what they have to say, so you can start to get a sense of where they have errors as opposed to mistakes. Yeah. Now, I mean, to be honest, Jade, yours is a great one because it's a mistake. It's not an error. You understand it, but you sort of describe it as a fossilized mistake. I think what happens there is a mistake you don't really care about. So, you know, so you're focused, you know. Yeah. Yeah, your focus is not really on it.
Yeah,
So,
sometimes you just want to convey the message.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
Like
yeah.
being careless.
yeah, it's just like being.
Yeah, but if someone said to you, yeah, I mean it's an error, it's a mistake, not an error. Yeah, that's basically what it is. Sorry, I'm not making myself very clear with my errors and mistakes. I might redo that slide for next time with some errors on it too. Local versus global is a similar kind of thing. Global errors cannot be interpreted and cause a complete communication breakdown, whereas local errors don't. Okay, so he, she thing in your case would be a local issue, not a global issue. Because if you say, oh, Lucy said da da da, then he said da da da, and it was clear it was the same person, everybody knows it's just a mistake in your pronouns. But a global mistake means that you're sitting there going, what? You know, so for example, Jenny Jenkins has one for pronunciation where, I might have used this before, where two learners are looking at one of those picture difference things to try and see what they have in their pictures that are the same and what they have that are different. And one says, do you have a let car? Let car. And this one says, you know, I don't have that. What they meant was red. So there was a problem with the le versus, so they used a le instead of a r, and they devoiced the d. So it became a t. So they ended up saying let car instead of red car. So this person did in fact have a red car. But when we talked to them afterwards, they assumed that this person meant a car for rent, a car to let. Okay. Even though there was a red car sitting there, they couldn't like make that distinction. So that's global. That's a real problem, because if every time you want to say, you know, a voiced D and a R, and you're constantly saying, and then devoicing final consonants, that could be really, really bad, right? So yeah, Savanas.
So as soon as a learner becomes aware of the wrong thing, the error turns into mistake. Well,
one thing that you have to try and do is help them. So, I mean, you know, again, there's no magic pill, right? I mean, your job as a teacher is to say, there's an error in your system. This is what you need, you know. Right now, you're devoicing every final consonant, voiced consonant. And so now you've got a problem, right? Well, now how do you fix that is another, you know, if we knew the answer to that, we'd all be, you know, I mean, obviously you try different things, right? You get them to practice, you get them to, you know, and hopefully, yes, you shift that error out of their system, you know, as much as possible, because you make them focus on it. It's part of the noticing hypothesis idea. You make them notice that this is a problem. So when they do it, they have strategies to that they can put in place. So part of my job, for example, with the international teaching assistants in Florida, was to show them where their errors were, because I didn't have time to teach them. You know, they had a 3-month session with me, and then they had to be able to teach chemistry or physics in English, or they'd lose their assistantship. So yeah, there was no time in many cases to change their language skills like that. What I could do instead was identify their systematic errors and give them strategies to deal with that. So they would make vocabulary lists on the board. So if they knew if it was one of the words that they couldn't pronounce real well, like conductor, which for some reason I remember, in an electrical engineering class, they would just point to the word conductor. So, you know, I couldn't fix all the problems. They couldn't fix all the problems. But between us, we could come up with strategies to mean that in these high-stakes situations, they could still function.
Like self-assess themselves and like be self-regulatory so that they.
Yes, this idea of agency and self-regulation. Right. I mean, I said to them, there's no magic bullet to suddenly change your language in the next 10 weeks, 12 weeks, you know, but what we can do is identify the gaps, the things that are going to cause a problem for your students. Because once you've got strategies to deal with that, then you'll be a more successful communicator. Your students will like you more. Sandy.
2 things. First one, wouldn't it be more helpful to know their system so that you kind of you are aware of the type of errors that they make? Like, you don't have to know their language. If you know it, of course, you will know the type of mistakes and anticipate. But if you don't know the language, at least know their system and the type of mistakes that they make.
So what can you do? What can and should you do at the beginning of a speaking pronunciation class for each of your students?
Yeah, well,
More than that. Yeah, you should be paying lots of attention throughout. But what do you do at the beginning?
Like the first class?
Yeah.
Let them talk about themselves.
expose them with as much as go over the alphabet.
Getting closer. Basically, give them a speaking pronunciation test. There's tons of them. You can pick them up off the internet, but you can also get them. There also should be, if it's a good textbook, they should have one in there. Okay, and you give them right at the beginning of the semester, you give them this test, and it usually comprises 2 or 3 different things. One would be something like the Please Call Susan passage. Does anyone heard of that? So you can look it up on the internet. It's called Please Call Susan. Tell her we need 3 scoops of ice cream, 2 green frogs, 6 blah, blah, blah. And basically it's every vowel and consonant combination in English. So you get them to read that for you, and that way you get an immediate sort of sense of where they are. Now, of course, what they could be making is mistakes versus errors, right? So that's one thing that you start to look at. Then you usually do a fluency passage, so you have them read something, tell you something spontaneously, and you do all this as an initial test in your first class.
Like a placement test?
Yes, and that creates, but it's not a placement test, obviously, because they're in your class. It's a sort of, I forget what they call it. Yeah, it's just a test they have in. Sorry, for some reason my brain is fried. I'll bring in a couple next week to show you. But it's basically a test that just gives you well, no, it's not proficiency. They're already in the class, so it's not a placement or proficiency test. It's
informal assessment?
Yeah, it's like an informal assessment test. So you can see what that particular student needs to focus on in that speaking class. Yeah, their weaknesses and their strengths, exactly. I will bring a couple in next week so you can see them. But good textbooks will have them in, and you do it the first day one. You write up a report, you work on those things through the semester, and then you do it at the end. And fingers crossed, you get some kind of difference between the beginning and the end of your hard 15 weeks of work in your speaking class. Yeah, but I'll bring some in. For some reason, my brain is fried, so I'll bring some in next week so you can take a look at them.
Diagnostic test.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wouldn't have been able to go to bed without.
No, and you know, this is why I'm delighted that we have such a thing as the internet, YouTube, and Wikipedia. Yes, that's exactly what it's called. It's called a diagnostic test. As soon as your students walk through the door, the first class, you do a diagnostic test, or you give them recorders, or you get them to do it at home, and then at the end you give them the same diagnostic test. And fingers crossed, something's happened in between. And I'll bring in a couple of examples of the diagnostic test for you for speaking. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm sorry. So then I go to my
second question. Yep.
So then going back to the example that you gave us.
Yeah.
The mistake, but it can be any really.
Yeah.
The same mistake for him can be an error for my students.
Yes.
Because I know why that's a mistake, because of Italian similar to Spanish, like the way it could probably be in Italian, but the way it is in Spanish, most probably my students would make that same error.
Right, right. Well, so Sal, I don't know, but I know that Sal says producers all the time, so I know that that's not an issue for him. But yes, the point is that that's exactly what you're doing with your diagnostic. You know, there's going to be, the diagnostic is just to give you a general idea of where your learner is at, okay? And then over time, you say, you know, well, in the diagnostic, he said 3 instead of 3, right? And then later on in class, he says 3. So you realize it's, you know, variation, right? Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And then you decide whether you're interested, whether you care about that or not, right? Is that a priority for that learner? Okay, probably not if there's more important issues, like, for example, the one I gave you, the either devoiced or completely reduced, disappearing consonant at the end of a syllable, right? The coda of the syllable. That's terrible. That's a real problem. So that might be what you actually want to spend your time focusing on. Did I tell you the Georgia State example? We had Vietnamese learners and at Georgia State, and Vietnamese has a real problem. Vietnamese learners often have a real problem with initial and final consonants in syllables. They have a very sort of straightforward CV structure, and so when you start doing CVC, CC, VC structures in English, you know, it starts getting too complicated. So in Georgia, there's an underground system, and Georgia State University is here, and then 3 stops along is Georgia Tech University. And our learner, a couple of our learners said, someone said, we want to go to Georgia State. And they ended up getting them to get off at Georgia Tech. So they ended up ways away and had to walk back. And this is the reason we found out, because they missed their class. Why? Because when they tried to say state, they said take. Because they didn't say the first S and they didn't say the last part there. So the listener in Georgia Tech decided they must be saying Georgia Tech, right? Not Georgia State. So that's a very, an example that just sort of made my day, because I've talked about it for the last 10 years, but it's true, right? That's a problem. That's a real problem. Yeah.
Global error.
Yeah, that's a global error, because it didn't just happen in that particular word. There was a real problem with coda final. So we set up a whole experiment working with that and so on. So yeah, good. Let me finish this up real quick, because I know you want to go home and I do too. So assessment, I got to check on the barn cat. So remember, we're not going to talk about it, and it talks about it a little bit in your book, and we have tried to get assessment as far as possible. And by assessment, I mean final assessment, not diagnostic assessment, in TESOL 2, but also I've realized over many years that assessment depends often on what institution you end up in. So you often don't get a choice over how you assess your learners' language skills. But if you did, you know, assessment should match purpose. I can't tell you the amount of times I've gone into a speaking and pronunciation class, and the students have been given written homework. I'm like, why are they doing written homework for a speaking and pronunciation class, right? They should be doing speaking homework and speaking testing, right? Not written testing. So, you know, you can use, now it's so easy. Now all the students have a microphone on their computer. You can just like get them to do an MP3 file and boom, there you are. In my day, I'd buy recorders and send them all home with a recorder, but you don't have to do any of that anymore. So meaning that assessment should match purpose, right? And secondly, that purpose should be explicit. It shouldn't be just is it speaking or is it writing? It should be, well, what kind of speaking? What is it my learner's got to do? If my learner's got to go, they're in a graduate class and they've got to go give a presentation, then my teaching and my assessment should somehow assess how well they can do that task. Okay, not how well they can chit chat with me on a 5-minute oral proficiency interview, right? So those are just a couple of things that you want to bear in mind. Any questions, issues, comments? Did that all make sense? So that's a really speedy journey through speaking. And next week we're going to do a speedy journey through listening. We just do these really speedy journeys. But of course, remember, with me, you're going to do 658, which will be sound systems only. With Dr. Cheng, you do writing only. You know, those of you that are in the PhD program, you'll do a colloquium and reading. So, you know, you'll get more of a chance to come back to all of these things. All right, so your discussion prompt is up, and I want you to think about the interlocutor effect that Brown talks about. What ways who your learner talks to, and particularly in class-based interaction, who you might give your learner to talk to, and how you organize that has an effect on the outcome of the task or the activity that you're doing. Okay, it's all ready for you. And for everybody outside, the three hard copies that we did here are already up for you.
And also the essay, right? The short essay.
Yes, the short essay is due for next week. Yep.
At the same.
Did anyone have any questions about that?
We talked about this, right, the last week.
Yeah.
Is summarize, include, right, like citation?
Yeah. So you just want a little, it's not very long, so it's going to be fairly, you want a little summary and a discussion. A couple.
13 pages, like 13 pages in the summarization.
Yeah, and you've only got 600 or 700 words. Yeah. Yep. So be, you know, brief. A couple of people already tried a couple of APA things online. I haven't seen anything from anyone here yet. Maybe you did, and I just haven't gotten to that yet. And I put up a couple of comments. One thing that a couple of people did was these half quotes. So something like, Caldwell says that in addition, he will, quote, give examples of Lord Rand's prejudices below, unquote, right? Not good, okay? 2 reasons. One, though these kind of half quotes are really bad, but the second thing is you should only quote things that you can't restate, okay? So in that case, there's nothing special about that statement, okay? When you quote, it should be because you want the actual words, because the actual words are important, okay? Not just because you can't work out how to rewrite it, okay? Your job is to work out how to rewrite it unless there's a specific reason that you want to quote. Jane?
The word, for example, Lord Rand can be quoted as this is just...
Yes, but you wouldn't need to quote that because you would already say Caldwell's 19, whenever this is, I didn't put this, shame on me, 1999 article, he invents a character called Lord Rand who, and you wouldn't need to put, you know, yeah, that's fine. So really think about why you're quoting what you're quoting. If you're quoting it, then it has to be properly quoted, page number, etc. There should not be a page number if there is no quote. Okay, if there is a quote, there should be a page number. If there is no quote, there shouldn't be a page number.
So paraphrasing is on the author.
Yes, if you're paraphrasing, there's no page number because you're paraphrasing. That's the whole point. If you're quoting, there must be a page number because you're quoting. But if you're quoting for a reason, not just because you can't be bothered to rephrase it. Okay? All right. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.